So I am going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, as Ben said, and about sort of this movement that we find ourselves, but also this moment that we find ourselves in. And I situate a lot of what I'm going to talk about in the context of Los Angeles, since that's sort of the project that we have here. So first, what is municipalism? So I think it's wonderful that you've been reading about this movement, but I'd be curious to hear what's your perception of what municipalism is. So you could either type it in the chat or just unmute yourself and call out what is your sense of what municipalism is.
I understood it as more power to local government.
Hmm. More power to local government. Uh-huh. Participatory, I see someone has written in the chat, participatory democracy at the local level. Uh-huh. Hmm. Yeah, I think direct democracy. Uh-huh. A moment of communities. I like that. Yeah, so I think so this is a lovely illustration by an artist named Carolyn Woolard, who worked closely with the New York City cooperatives movement. Um, Yeah, so I think municipalism can mean many different things. I mean, it's a sort of it's a broad term that describes a diversity of different sort of perspectives and opinions. But I think there are some elements that are I think in common to all of those perspectives, which are definitely sort of participatory democracy, direct democracy, which some of you have mentioned, at the local level, at the municipal or the city level, um, and also democracy in economy as well as in political decision making. I think in recent practice, there's also been a feminization of politics. So, politics that really infuses and thinks about gender equity in the way that decisions are made and in the way that resources are delegated. And then also, I think like a form of economic relationships that are anti-capitalist, that are not about reproducing the current sort of dominant system of the market economy and exploitation of wage labor, but some sort of kind of transformation of those types of relationships. So it's assemblage of a lot of different sort of terms and ideas under the name of municipalism. I think the person that's often credited as the um, parent of municipalism in its more recent incarnation is a libertarian social ecologist named Murray Bookchin, who was active, I'd say, in the latter half of the last century. He was a New Yorker that later moved to Vermont and established a group called the Institute for Social Ecology there, and really sort of, started his thinking in terms of after an early sort of career in as a sort of Marxist thinker, kind of expanded that to think about the ecology and climate, and was a thinker that's linked social conditions, so conditions under capitalism, to the sort of ecological crisis. And later in his life talked about the need to sort of take power and participate in decision making at the local level, as a way to challenge both capitalism and also the powers of the state as well. And talked about how once people sort of, have sort of participatory control over their municipalities, they can then form confederations at the municipal level, and so that would be a way of achieving scale at the local level. Um, and there's I think this was optional reading for today, but there's there's a lot of different examples, as I mentioned, of municipalism, and they've been organized into three types by an urban scholar who's based out in the UK, Matthew Thompson, into platform municipalism, which I think Barcelona is a good example of, and I think Los Angeles is a nascent example of. Autonomous municipalism, which I think Jackson, Mississippi is a great example of, and also managed municipalism. So it just to show sort of the wide breadth of what municipalism could be. So platform municipalism, which I'll talk more about in the context of Los Angeles, is when different social movements come together and create literally a platform. Sometimes it's mediated by technology as well, a platform of different demands that are, created by folks at the grassroots level. And it's a sort of a response against privatization and neoliberalization of the economy. Autonomous municipalism, which is oftentimes a federation of different autonomous and independent projects, such as worker cooperatives. I think in Jackson, Mississippi, I think it's an assemblage of different sort of cooperative projects, and under their plan to create sort of a new sort of cooperative city, which has since been reproduced by other places as well, such as in Humboldt, California, Richmond, California, and others. And then managed municipalism, which I think Cleveland is a good example of here in this country, where different nonprofit foundations have come together, and it's more sort of a technocratic solution, and have decided to replicate the example of Mondragon in Spain and create, cooperative enterprises that are anchored by large institutions in the city, such as universities and health systems. So it can take a lot of different forms, and I think the actor can also vary in these three different models. So I think, again, just to ground us more in the context of Los Angeles, so Los Angeles is a city of over 500 square miles. We have almost 4 million people. We have over 400 different neighborhoods. Most of us are tenants. Almost 50%, almost half of us are Latinx. About a quarter of us live in poverty. And based on the last count, there are over 60,000 of us that are unhoused, and that's probably an undercount. So it's a very large municipality. And our hypothesis here in Los Angeles is that we have the similar social movement conditions so that we can replicate a form of platform municipalism similar to the example of Barcelona in Camus, which was the platform that was created in 2014, 2015 in that city. So this is a diagram of the structure that Barcelona and Camus created to support their platform. So a lot of it was based on sort of input from neighborhood assemblies, which sat in the sort of larger context of a community sort of Congress giving input into a list of policy demands that were created to represent the different needs of people in the city. They have since then refined their platform, and they ran a candidate who came out of the anti-eviction movement, which is known as, the acronym is PAH, P-A-H, and they elected a mayor, Ada Kalau, in 2015, who still holds office, and the administration is sort of directed by this people's platform. So our hypothesis is in that Los Angeles, this is the moment, this is the municipalist moment for us to do something similar here. In a city with a different history, a different context, but I think similar conditions. So the assumptions that are guiding this sort of our sort of moment is that movements go through cycles. So, you know, typically there's a trigger event, you know, that you know, sort of represents the sort of pent up sort of emotions and issues that a group faces, and that leads to an increase in activity and social movement activation. And then, you know, usually there's some sort of, you know, enactment of some of the movement demands. It's not complete, but it's usually some, you know, version of it. And then there's a period of lower energy, lower activation. And you can see this in a lot of different sort of movement upswells. So I think most recently in 2020, we had the uprisings around that was activated by the murder of George Floyd. And there was a great sort of outpouring of activation, of emotion, which, you know, later led to some changes. In Los Angeles, it led to $30 million being reallocated. Typically, that's given to the police budget that was then reallocated towards community and social services. And yet, you know, the police budget was still increased in 2020 and subsequently as well. So there's a lot of sort of disillusionment and sort of reflection over that phase. And in general, I would say it's a period of low sort of activity and low movement here in Los Angeles. I'm curious, just to kick it back to you all, where do you think the moment is in terms of the social movement? You could call it out, or you could type it in
I
the
would
chat.
say like maybe disillusionment right now,
Mm-hmm.
because we haven't, like, not much has changed, and so people have kind of lost momentum and things have kind of slowed down since then.
Mm-hmm.
I would say it feels sort of place specific for me right now. I'm calling in from Alabama, and it feels like we're having a bunch of triggering events right now.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm interested to see if there is more of a general uprising instead of specific movement uprising.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wanted to add to that. The only thing that I guess would be, if we're talking about the BLM movement, it would be interesting in this chart of, you know, if another movement crops up, what that does to this, because I think, you know, BLM in itself might be in disillusionment, but what does that have to do with all these other different, you know, movements that have cropped up, and does that sway people away, or is that why there's been some, but maybe I'm overthinking that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I see Gabe's got their hand up.
Yeah, I'm looking at the graph or the chart, I guess, and I don't know. I feel like it portrays movements as some reactionary event, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with that. I think the reason a lot of movements tend to fade out is because they're treated as reactionary rather than planning ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I'll put myself on the stack. I appreciate all the comments, but also especially the last two. You know, the idea, you know, that Kristen expressed, that the movement moves on multiple terrains at the same time, and you know that there are intersections of different parts of the movement. So what's triggering in one place, and Marissa, you mentioned this too in terms of context and place, may not be elsewhere. So and also Gabe, you know, your point about the strategic, you sort of dimensions of movement building, that there are always triggers. And it's a question of whether people mobilize in response, not just whether the outrage is so great that it sort of shocks the senses and people are capable of mobilizing. So I appreciate this movement cycle graph, but I think it does have, it's more complex as others have pointed out as well. And I feel that in terms of climate, we're on the verge of another series of major mobilizations right now. I mean, I'm already seeing them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I think those are really good sort of points. And I think, I think this is a very simplified version of representing sort of, how movements work. And I think, there are a lot of sort of timelines and trajectories that are sort of happening on multiple dimensions all at the same time. And I think absolutely, I think, I think movements aren't reactionary. I would agree with that. And I think that, this is why I think if we are at a low, I would say from my vantage point, we are at a low energy point. And so this is the opportunity to build in anticipation that there is going to be another upsurge. And I think to plan for that too, so that, things can be in place. So when there is another sort of moment, whether it's in the climate sort of arena, whether it's in, anti-carceral sort of organizing, that there will be the infrastructure in place so that we can take advantage of that surge. And when I was talking previously about the Los Angeles context, I should also mention two things. In the last year, we, as part of the Democratic Socialists of Los Angeles, we elected, we have institutions called neighborhood councils in Los Angeles. So we have over 100 neighborhood councils that were created after the '92 uprisings, which was in response to another sort of really polarizing, triggering event, the sort of videotaped beating of that was then later released of a Black man by police officers named Rodney King. And there was a large sort of uprisings of different groups in Los Angeles in 1992. And it was, it's a very complicated, I think there's more to say about it, but as a result, in South LA, a former city council person, Mark Ridley Thomas, established community neighborhood assemblies called empowerment congresses as a way to sort of, as a realization that people had sort of concerns that were not being addressed by city government, by the municipality. So he implemented those. And then at the same time, sort of concurrently, there were NIMBYs. They were sort of forces in the San Fernando Valley that wanted to secede from the city in 1999. So there were a lot of different sort of factors that were happening at the time. And so the city amended its charter for the second time in 1999 to create neighborhood councils as a sort of middle ground way to move forward. And for the most part, they're dominated by a lot of sort of property owners, business developers, business interests. And last year, there was an effort to elect socialists onto the neighborhood councils. So we elected over 120 socialists into 40 neighborhood councils. And I think it's been an interesting exercise, but it's also sort of introduced a lot of folks in the progressive space in Los Angeles to organizing at the neighborhood level and also at the municipal level. So it's created sort of more attention towards city policies and decision making. And, I think there's also just an interesting confluence. This also happens to be the 30th anniversary of the '92 uprisings. It was this time 30 years ago that the sort of civil unrest was happening. So sorry, I just wanted to mention that is sort of part of the sort of context shaping where our moment is at in Los Angeles. The second assumption for us is the 3.5% rule. So this is based on research that I think it's a sociologist, and Erica Chenoweth, and a nonviolent civil disobedience organizer, Miria Steffen, put together. They put together a database of different social movements over a period of time and calculated participation rates, and found that in order for substantive change to happen, like a regime change, you only need 3.5% of the population to be involved in that social movement. So it's not 90%, it's not 51%, it's 3.5%, which is, you know, for us here in a city of 4 million people, a lot more doable than, you know, than 4 million people. It's 150,000 people that we need to activate in our sort of project. And then the third assumption is that, you know, people already are organized. I think it's a fallacy to assume that people aren't, you know, sort of already talking to each other and sort of have an analysis of what is wrong and what the solutions are. So people, you know, are already organized, you know, through their churches, through their neighborhood groups, you know, through their sort of social interactions. And so how do we tap into those networks, those existing networks? And it's also a recognition that movements themselves are moving towards more of a decentralized structure. So, you know, I think if institutions and social movements were more centralized, you know, during, let's say, the civil rights movement, you know, since the advent, especially of technology like the internet, you know, communication is more decentralized, leadership and decision making is more distributed to some extent. So much of what our project is going to be in Los Angeles is mapping out where those existing networks are in our 400 plus neighborhoods across the city, and building, you know, connections with existing nodes in the network. So our timeline, so we're studying the timeline that Barcelona and Camus operated under. So they first, you know, created different neighborhood committees, which advanced proposals and, you know, then formulated, you know, policy demands, which was then created, you know, consolidated into one draft framework across the city, which then got further input. And then that ultimately became the platform for Barcelona and Camus. So our timeline for Los Angeles for All, which is the group that is operating, is promoting this 2-year project, this 2-year experiment, is that we're launching on May 1st, which is International Workers' Day, May Day. So we're also having an opening panel of a learning series where we are also learning about municipalism like you all. I think because we want to learn more from other examples from, you know, around the world. And then, as I mentioned, we're spending most of the rest of this year mapping out existing networks. I think we're going to be using a relational organizing app called Empower, which to help us sort of think about, you know, what are the connections between our contact networks and the networks across different neighborhoods in Los Angeles. And then we're going to launch with neighborhood assemblies in the next year in 2023, you know, similar to Barcelona, you know, advance, you know, different platforms at the neighborhood level, and then ultimately consolidate those into, you know, one sort of draft framework that we might, you know, sort of have some sort of gathering of different neighborhoods, different policy interests, different sectoral interests into some Congress or convention in the fall of 2023 to formally finish. And then once we have a platform, I think, you know, I think there's a lot of different possibilities for where we could go. You know, we've talked about, we could do something similar to what Barcelona did. We could advance a candidate. You know, our mayoral elections are happening this year. So most of our work will happen off cycle, not during an election season, which I think is good because I think it'll give us an opportunity to sort of not get caught up in that campaign cycle, but really kind of situate ourselves in what's going on in different neighborhoods. But that's one option to run a candidate, which is also something actually that there's a group in Vancouver for All, that we're in touch with. So they're running candidates currently right now in their municipal elections on their platform. We could also hold candidates accountable to the platform. That's another option in the 2024 elections. And that's a third option, which I think most of us are kind of more leaning towards, is pursuing a dual power strategy. So actually creating the conditions and the meeting the demands that are advanced by the platform and creating it ourselves based on our own sort of momentum. So as I mentioned, we're launching on May Day. So we have a panel. We have an incredible panel of folks, including the founder of Cooperation Jackson, Kali Akuno, an incredible sort of abolitionist, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's based out of New York at the CUNY Graduate Center. And she was previously in Los Angeles and has written a lot about the sort of rise of the prison industry here. Ananya Roy, who is based out here, who writes a lot about sort of poverty from a critical perspective and writes a lot about cities in India and the global South. And also Malik Simone, who's based out of the UK, who also does a lot of work on Asia and also on Africa as well. So what I appreciate about our panel is that I think they're really sort of bringing the perspective of the global South to the question of municipalism and what is this political moment that we're in right now. And then, at the same time, we are having a party, because who doesn't love a party? We're having a party in Los Angeles. So to sort of watch the panel together, and then also just to sort of gather in community and in celebration, because it's been a very difficult time for many of us for the past 2 years. So just to have a moment of joy and have that as a place that we sort of launch our experiment. So this is a friend, Marshall Trammell, who performs under Music Research Strategies, he's an improvisational drummer and composer. So he's going to be performing at our event. So with that, I will pause and love to hear your questions. And actually, I think I'm going to stop sharing so that I can see folks' faces, but let me just really quickly put up my contact information. So feel free to reach out to me, and I hope that you all will attend our inaugural panel on May Day. So you can RSVP at municipalism.org. And you can also learn more about our experiment in Los Angeles, certainly in the subsequent months to come, at losangelesforall.org.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Always we get the silent applause and the visible applause and then the hands and so on, but really I learned a great deal. I think we all did from what you shared already. So let's open it up. We have enough people here that I think it would be handy to go with a stack, if that's all right with you, Yvonne. And just to let you know, it's a mix of undergrads who are Next System Fellows, and then a number of doctoral students who are here as well from sociology. So that's who we have in the room. So who'd like to start? Response, a question, some thinking. Bears very directly on at least one person's research doctoral thesis here. I see them nodding their head, but certainly others too. Now that I ask for open questions, everybody's silent. But when Yvonne, you were doing it earlier, it was bubbling more, eh? Yeah.
I was
Excellent.
curious. Oh,
Go
sorry.
ahead, go for it. There we go.
You mentioned that there was a large socialist movement, people that were brought into the Los Angeles governance. How was that received by the public? Was there pushback? Was there a lot of bad press? You know, I'm just curious.
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think there's actually been positive press because I think a lot of folks, at least on the left here in Los Angeles, were really excited to see, you know, sort of folks taking on institutional power. I'm serving on my neighborhood council, which is in El Sereno, which is in Northeast Los Angeles, and I think there's about 5 of us on a council of 15 folks, and we're, you know, I think our demographics really reflect Los Angeles. We're very working class, Latinx community, and I think, you know, we sort of caught folks with in an element of surprise, you know, because I think they weren't expecting us. There's 3 of us that serve on the executive committee, 3 out of 5, so we have a majority there. So I think when we first were seated, our first act was to defund the Night Out event, which is typically sort of a national, you know, PR opportunity for the police department to, you know, do events with the community. So we sort of, you know, voted down a motion to fund that event and instead held our own event called the Night Out for Safety and Liberation at a community garden, which was beautiful. We had, you know, a gathering of, you know, different community resources. We have a food pantry here that provided free food for folks. We had a Know Your Rights training from the National Lawyers Guild, an expungement clinic from the Public Defenders Union, and, you know, speakers from the Chicano Moratorium, which is a sort of a really great sort of movement elders here in Los Angeles, and also Black Lives Matters. So that happened. And, you know, I think since then, I think a lot of the sort of NIMBYs have sort of are aware now that we are a slate. And so we recently tried to vote in opposition to a municipal ordinance called 4118, which basically it's the anti-camping ban or an anti-homeless ban. So it makes it a misdemeanor, and it if you sleep or sit or lie on the sidewalk in certain places, you know, so since over the course of the pandemic, the city has moved the unhoused community into temporary hotel rooms under a city-funded project called Project Room Key, which is, you know, it's better than, you know, sleeping on the street, and it provides a modicum of safety, but at the same time, these are carceral spaces. So folks are surveilled and monitored, and their, you know, their movements are, you know, controlled, tightly controlled. And there are also sites for a lot of outbreak of COVID as well. So they're actually not sort of healthy places. And at the same time, there's not enough rooms. I think, you know, at the height of the Omicron surge, there was no more capacity for Project Room Key. So folks had nowhere to go but, you know, stay on the street, and where they were then subject to this new municipal code. So we fought it, but unfortunately we were outvoted in El Sereno, and we weren't able to defeat 4118 in our neighborhood. So I think to some extent, this sort of new project, Los Angeles for All, is a recognition that, you know, while we do have some institutional power, it's not enough at the neighborhood level. We need to sort of come together across different neighborhoods and create a shared platform. So it's been it's been a good learning experience for us to sort of seize power, sort of, meet with other neighborhood activists and understand neighborhoods better. And I think that lays the groundwork so that when we do start convening assemblies here at the neighborhood level, we have those connections to do that.
Great, thank you so much. I appreciate your time and you waking up early and everything, and all your information, and really enjoyed your book. And I'm the doctoral student that this directly relates to, so I'll definitely be reaching out. So thank you so much.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about your work.
Yeah.
You want to just say a little bit about it, Katiana, before we go
sure.
on?
Yeah. So, so I'm waiting for approval from from my proposal.
We're going back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm looking to examine how nurturing or preventative investments in communities versus enforcement or forceful investments can shape a community to be more safe, equitable, and sustainable, and really to demonstrate the role of minority and women in those decision making and the importance of having those voices. So I'll be looking at 2 case studies in Kansas City, Missouri, and DC, but looking at the legislative aspects, the community aspects, the leadership, as well as the limitations by the authority. So hearing what you were just saying was really helpful about the you can't sit law, I mean, so that's these little things that, not little, but these things that are not often discussed that really can have impact. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
I also just want to acknowledge, I said earlier, all doctoral grad students, but actually we have a grad student in global studies and we have students in integrative studies here too. So just glad that you guys are here as well. Marissa.
Thank you. Thanks, Yvonne. This was really great. I actually I'm trying to get my my mind situated, so I may not ask this question correctly, but I look forward to keeping up with you in the future and what's happening. So one thing that I wondered, it's kind of 3 questions. I've been dissertating in the middle of the night, so I feel like my head's not very clear right now. But so one of the questions I had was sort of about the timing that it's taken you all to get here from. I mean, obviously we were having conversations about 30 years ago with Rodney King, which seems like insane that that's been 30 years ago. And I think you talked about that a little, but I wonder about timing. And then I also wonder, I'm a critical university scholar, and I'm always interested in the roles that universities play, in particular with movements like this. And so I know you have like a lot of folks who are speaking who are coming from a university setting, and obviously California is quite well known, especially in sort of labor movement work in the university. So I wondered if you could speak about that. And then the last question is, you were talking about Bookchin and the idea that like once there is a sort of municipal power, that people can then work to create sort of Confederate networks. And if that's something that you all are, I mean, obviously I hear you talking about the Cooperation Jackson, and I feel like I heard Cleveland and some other places. And is there like a network that's going on amongst cities in the US in that regard? And that's all.
Those are great questions. So let me take them in reverse, if that's okay. So I think as far as the idea that Bookchin came up with sort of a confederation of different sort of liberated zones, I think that there's an effort to sort of network those cities in a number of different sort of groups are trying to map out those networks. One is Fearless Cities, which is the international sort of arm and education arm of Barcelona and Camus. So they, I think, published the book that you read a chapter out of, that Debbie Bookchin, who was Murray's daughter, wrote the chapter for. But they also have a network. So if you go to their website, fearlesscities.com, they have a map of different municipalist projects across the world. Here in North America, there's a group called Symbiosis, which is also trying to create a sort of, confederation of different projects. So their website is symbiosis-revolution.org. So they, include groups like Cooperation Tulsa, Woodbine in New York City, Detroit Build and Fight, which is very much inspired by Cooperation Jackson. I mean, I think in all of these different examples, Cooperation Jackson is probably the sort of leading, it's where the vision is most developed and specific. The Jackson Kush plan, the idea to create a Black, a Black community, a new home for the Black community in the South. Yeah, and then Ben just included the website for the U.S. Solidarity Economy Network. So absolutely, that's a network of different sort of efforts to create a different type of an economy, a solidarity economy. Yes, and I think the idea in convening this learning series is also to bring together folks that are sort of doing these experiments and doing this work across different places. And then as far as your second question, the role of universities in movements, yeah, I think absolutely. I think here in Los Angeles and California, we have great sort of public universities like the University of California system that's been closely connected to a lot of social movements, including, the move for ethnic studies here, the movement for labor organizing as well. And I think we have a close relationship to an institute that Ananya Roy is affiliated with, the Institute on Inequality and Democracy. So she's been enormously helpful in terms of just helping to sort of help us shape and think through the learning series, as well as future, ideas for sessions for the learning series. So May Day is just the first opening panel. We're planning a session every quarter. So our next quarter after May will be in August. And there's a colleague who's based in Italy who's convening a session on the subject of municipalist platforms. So we're inviting folks from Barcelona, as well as Bologna, Italy, who also, there's a civic coalition that's based there. And in Croatia, Zagreb is ours. So just those three different examples of municipalist platforms. And then Ananya has been really helpful in connecting us with groups in Berlin who are working on expropriating housing that's currently owned by large private landlords, and turning them into social housing that's controlled by the community. So there's a really vibrant tenants movement in Berlin that's working towards this. And so she's connecting us with some folks. So I think we're going to do a section around housing. But absolutely, I think it's really helpful to have, sort of public institutions that are really engaged in the movement and in sort of promoting it here. And then as far as your third question, the timing, yes, I mean, it's been 30 years, which I think is just so, that wasn't sort of, top of mind when we started, organizing around this, but we since sort of realized that this was in the 30th anniversary. So that's definitely, I think, setting the context that, it's been over a generation since the biggest urban uprisings in our city that we're now thinking about seizing community control. I think it's really interesting. Like another activist pointed out to me recently that, I think to some extent in 1992, people it was more reactionary. People were responding because, there was a lot of pent up feelings and frustrations that had been harbored over, decades of neglect, especially in neighborhoods in South Los Angeles, which is more sort of populated by the Black and Latinx community. And it's very working class, it's very low income. And, more recently with the Black Lives Matters protests that we had in 2020, so there was a lot of destruction of property in South Los Angeles, in the neighborhoods where Black and brown folks lived in 1992. And whereas in 2020, the organizers of Black Lives Matters strategically had the protests happen not in South LA, but in Beverly Hills, in Santa Monica, in neighborhoods that are mostly white and upper middle class. And that was a strategy that I think, on the one hand, it was to sort of get the word out about the need to defund the police and to stop murders, but also on the other hand, to sort of challenge the sort of property owning classes, and to kind of situate the conflict in their neighborhoods. Whereas these were neighborhoods that were sort of the only neighborhoods that were protected by the local police departments during the 92 uprisings. So I think we've come a long way, in terms of timing, in terms of, being able to sort of anticipate and to prepare for movement upsurges and to think strategically about things.
Wow. I see that we have a hand here from Kristen, and what I want to do is encourage maybe a couple folks to get on the stack. I think we have about 20 minutes, which is a good amount of time for discussion, but it might go pretty fast. So let's see if anybody else would like to get on the stack. I actually have some questions too, but I'm sitting on them to open up space for others. Kristen, anybody else? Okay, let's go to Kristen and then me.
Okay. I have a question that it could just be a simple no, but I'm curious, do you think, has there been more people involved that you've seen in the process that maybe weren't actors that you would think would be naturally involved with the process, given maybe COVID's effect on people really looking around at their own communities? I mean, I think every single column I've seen over the past couple of weeks, has sort of cited the end of globalization. And I think they're more talking about, global supply chains and whatnot. But I do think there is potentially this honing in on local networks and, people who used to think, oh, LA, New York, Paris, kind of thinking, oh yeah, wait, this is my neighborhood. Is there, do you think there is any relevance there? Like I said, it could be a simple no, but I'm just curious if more actors have gotten involved or, community members who may not naturally have. Thanks.
Yeah, actually, I would say yes. I think that a lot of, I mean, we've all been sort of confined to our places in the past 2 years. So I know for myself, I've certainly, in my neighborhood, I've been fortunate to be able to work from home for the last 2 years, and I've, developed relationships with my neighbors. I started a mutual aid network in my neighborhood during COVID and reached out to elders and supported unhoused folks, and created a network within a 4-block radius of where I live. So it's very hyper local in my situation. And I think it's been the case for other folks as well, I think, who maybe have been more focused on, other types of geographic scales, but have been thinking more locally. And I would say that, I think, I think the neighborhood council project was really successful because a lot of us were sitting at home and, you know, we're sort of thinking at the neighborhood level for the first time in some cases, and, you know, had time on our hands to get involved in neighborhood council meetings, which can be very long 4 or 5 hour affairs. So absolutely, you know, and, you know, so I think, yes, I think there are circumstances, you know, the sort of really exceptional circumstances of the past few years that have had us thinking locally. And I think it's a strategic turn that a lot of places have been taking even before the pandemic. I mean, I think, you know, like in Barcelona, I've mentioned the you know, the movement, you know, really kind of it took off after their version of Occupy, the Indignados movement, and, you know, sort of decided to not just occupy public spaces, but also occupy institutions. So, you know, run for municipal office. And I think, you know, I think that, yeah, and I would say that I think, you know, just seeing all the other examples in these sort of spaces that are confederating municipal projects, I think a lot of them predate the pandemic. I would say actually, to some extent, a lot of them were started before the pandemic, and the pandemic actually put a pause on a lot of municipalist projects. But I think we're slowly starting to come together again, just like here in Los Angeles, May Day, it's sort of a call for us to gather again safely and probably masked as well. So I think, you know, I think the pandemic has had sort of both of those impacts on us organizing. It's both been encouraging, and also to some extent it's been difficult in other cases for certain projects to sort of come together. I think that there is currently a new project that Cooperation Jackson and Cooperation Humboldt is spearheading, called the People's Network for Land and Liberation. So they're trying to gather different sort of what they call liberated zones together that are operating at the municipal and local level into a networked social movement to support each other through, you know, potentially creating a supply chain, regional supply chains that can help to sort of, that are based on cooperation and can help to support these different places. And I think that was a project that was also started before the pandemic, but is, you know, was paused, but is starting to sort of take shape as well. Yeah.
Wonderful. All these pieces are coming together, and it's great to see that. And when I say pieces, I mean there are things that you're referencing that we've touched on at various places, both here but also in other talks at Mason this past year, and yet, but there's a synthesis in the way you're presenting it that is, you know, really enlightening. And I should just say for everybody here, I'm under the weather, which is why I'm not in my office right now. So I'm huddling at home. So I apologize for the delay in getting to my questions. And then I see Lupe, you're up next. So I'm going to follow Marissa. I have two. One is along the lines of what you were just speaking to, Yvonne, the sort of work of Cooperation Humboldt and Cooperation Jackson would seem to fall in that autonomous type or category. And thank you so much for sharing that reading that from Thompson, I believe, right? With the three categories, the autonomous, the platform, and then also the managed sort of models. You know, I'm curious about how you're thinking about how those different kinds of approaches can mutually reinforce each other, as opposed to, and also where some of the points of friction might be between those different kinds of approaches. So that's sort of one strategic question that's on my mind often, and I'm sure you've had some thoughts and experience with that. And the other question I have also follows on Marissa's earlier question of not just about the university, but also about sort of the research process. and you know, how you're going about your work as an organizer and as a researcher at the same time. And here at Mason, we have a commitment to engaged research, not just in sociology, but across many programs. How are you thinking about that engaged research process for yourself?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, you know, to the latter question, you know, I think, I sort of see this sort of process as a learning process, a collective learning process for everyone, which is why, you know, we're not only embarking on this project to organize a citywide people's platform, but we also have a learning series happening at the same time because I think, and we're creating this space for other folks who are participating in projects to come together and learn together, because I think it's a process of discovery for everyone, and so I see that sort of as a collective kind of learning experience and process of inquiry. I think as far as like I think there might also be opportunities for us to document what we learn. So, I think the learning series provides a great opportunity to transcribe some of the talks that happen and kind of think about maybe publishing them in different articles. We haven't really developed those ideas very much, but that's definitely a possibility. Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be interesting. I'm looking forward to sort of seeing the outcome of this experiment, of this hypothesis, and to see if our assumptions are correct in 2 years' time. If we do have a people's platform at the end of 2 years. So I think that will be something that, as a researcher, as an actor, as a social actor, it'll be really interesting to document. As far as your former question about those 3 different approaches, I think these are definitely ideal types. I think it's helpful sometimes to sort of think in terms of typologies, but there is also limitations and there are generalizations in terms of, it's taking sort of multifaceted, complex institutions and then boiling it down to a template. And I think it's also helpful when you're looking at the field to sort of think about these sort of, general examples as a way to sort of, compare them, contrast them. So I would say just from, I would say that the 2 examples of platform and autonomous municipalism that Thompson writes about are more sort of bottom up, kind of oriented, and that's where they sort of take their energy from. Whereas to me, it seems like the managed municipalism project is more top down. It's more sort of catalyzed by experts or technical specialists, who can inform the creation. Like in the case of Cleveland, it's, I think I mentioned this before, it's the creation of worker-owned cooperatives that are providing procurement for large-scale institutions or anchor institutions in the city, such as hospitals and universities. I know the example in Preston, England less well, but I think it's also, similar. It's inspired by the Cleveland example. And I believe that Joe's organization, The Next System, is closely affiliated with the Democracy Collaborative, which is the sort of consultant on both of these case studies, both Preston as well as Cleveland. So I think given that the approaches to those projects are coming from different places, I could see there being conflict, in those different approaches, one being sort of more kind of grassroots oriented, the other being sort of more technocratic. I certainly see that within the solidarity economy field, there's a difference between, folks that represent large scale sort of worker owned cooperatives like Mondragon, or folks in Montreal that are coming from an ecosystem that is very well organized into worker cooperatives, but there being a difference in the international scale, in the international scene, between the folks that represent large scale worker owned cooperatives and folks from Los Angeles or from the United States that are more scrappy and kind of coming from an anti-capitalist social movement perspective. So I could see that playing out, similarly in dynamics if these kind of different approaches sort of encounter each other in the same space. I think there's also a difference between platform municipalism and autonomous municipalism. I feel like there's more of an interaction in the platform example with existing political institutions, whereas I think autonomous municipalism is really interested in creating, as the name sort of says, independent institutions, independent of existing, the state or the existing economy, but creating independent groups. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. And I threw in the chat another example. You mentioned Joe Guinan, the Next System Project, and the Democracy Collaborative. They, I will share that they have some critiques of their own work. I mean, they've learned from the Cleveland sort of experiment and also from Preston. And there's also a project in Scotland with North Ayrshire, which is actually quite exciting and it's a much higher level. I mean, it's a very high level of participation. So it's both sort of top down, but also bottom up, which I threw in there, which I know that they're also working with right now. But that was great. Lupe.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, cool. So my question is about community and culture. More specifically, just thinking about like metropolitan areas like LA, and I see that you were in New York for a period of time. Like, how do you think that specific communities, like for example, the Latinx community, which I'm a part of, do you think that there is like a drive for more of this like cooperative thinking? But how, and then in that same boat, how do you deal with people who may be scared to come into participation because maybe their immigration status isn't because that's kind of my biggest question. Is I was illegal for a long time, and all of this like community like getting involved is something that I was very interested in, but there's fear when it comes to dealing with government when it comes to that. So how do you is there like something? Yeah, I don't know how to ask the question, but yeah, that's kind of
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think I mentioned that Los Angeles is almost 50% Latinx, and I don't know I mean, there's been research that tries to estimate the number of folks that are undocumented. I'm sure it's a sizable portion of our community, and I think that's a growing population across the United States. So I think working with folks that are vulnerable is definitely top of mind, and I think because it represents a really important group that's often at the margins, that's not sort of participating in civic decision making, and so I think our process is not collaborating with immigration officials and not collaborating with law enforcement, very, very explicitly not collaborating. So, we want to, and I think that's why we're doing this network mapping exercise, so that people can participate from their own existing networks. And so that hopefully will help people to feel comfortable about participating and not feel fearful about exposing themselves. And I think that's also our same approach to thinking about working with the unhoused community. So, we have a really great activist named Theo Henderson who teaches us a lot about, the daily struggles that unhoused folks face. If they leave the place that they're making their home on the street to attend a meeting, there's a fear that it might not be there when they get back because it'll be swept away by officials, or it's just a lot of different challenges. And so we're thinking, how can we go to the places where there are settlements and have assemblies there? Or how can we, work with a group of folks to secure their housing, maybe by renting church space or something like that for a week. So at least for that week, that's something that they don't have to worry about, and that they can kind of think about something else. So I think we're trying to kind of think through these different challenges for different groups that are really vulnerable in this world. And as far as sort of the drive for cooperative thinking in different communities, especially immigrant communities, I did work previously. I was really inspired by Jessica Gordon Nebhart, who's a mentor of mine. And I was really inspired by her work looking at the cooperative tradition in Black communities. And I was interested to see if there were similar lineages in the Asian American experience. And I found that there were, which was incredible. It wasn't easily documented because there's so many different languages in the Asian American experience. But there's been ways both in ancestral homes as well as in the immigrant experience that folks have survived because they've cooperated, whether that was, coming up with mutual aid societies to benefit immigrants when they arrived in this country, or, coming up with cooperative land ownership when the Asian Exclusion Act was in effect as a way to sort of, do agriculture especially in California. There are still large cooperatives that are remaining to this day that were set up during that time by Sikh and Japanese farmers. So I think, and I haven't investigated the Latinx community. I know that's something that Jessica was interested in, but then she said she got so sort of immersed in the sort of project to document the Black cooperative experience that her initial intent was to look at different sort of groups. But I'm sure that, I know, for instance, there's a practice of, pooling resources, pooling money, by contributing every month into a pool. And then that gets dispersed to one family and it changes from month to month. That's a tradition that exists in a lot of different communities. So I think that there is a history that can be, that exists and that can be identified, and that can also be used in sort of, if you make the links to contemporary practice too.
So that's so interesting because I grew up with that. I didn't understand what it was. It was called tanda. And every month my family would give like money and I'd be like, why is this lady taking our money? But then like one month, I don't know, I got a doll or something. I'd be like, oh, this is nice. So yeah, I'm very familiar with that, but I've never really thought about it in that context.
Wow. So Lupe, it sounds like a project, a book for you, perhaps. Yeah, we'll talk about that. I just want to also acknowledge that we received a contact from the Virginia Asian Chamber of Commerce about the upcoming Democratizing Nova Summit. They're very interested in it, will be participating and have registered. So just I'm seeing some possibilities there in the here and now. So really wonderful, wonderful things that are happening in this region too. Yvonne, I think we're at time right now, but this is, of course, just another step forward. I know some of us, maybe more than some, will be there on May Day. I'll probably be there with my kids crawling all over me online with your launch, and congratulations on that. And really look forward to staying in touch in the future as everybody continues to build and learn from each other. Any last comments anybody has for Yvonne Yen Liu today? No. Well, thank you so much again for getting up early, taking time to present. We'll share this with colleagues here with our Urban Research Hub in particular. I know a few of you are involved with that, and really appreciate it. Take care.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much.